Welcome into Classic Wax, brought to you by the Beat Sessions. I'm your host, Mitchell Weary. Happy New Year to all of you. We're getting there. It is almost time. It's crazy to think that half the world is in 2025 already now. We're still stateside, if you're over here, still living in the 2024 mode for a few more hours. But I want to thank you all for joining me tonight. Seems like kind of a weird night to do the show, given the holiday. If all of you are out having a good time doing your thing, you can always catch this episode some other time. But, we had to cancel last week's show. I didn't say we have to. There weren't a whole lot of options as far as album releases on Christmas Eve. New Year's Eve is kind of a similar story, but there are a couple exceptions out there. There was a couple records that I was looking at, trying to make a decision on, and ultimately landed on Steve Winwood, a fascinating artist. One of, I think as I've gotten older, he's the guy that I got into more. Obviously knowing about bands like Traffic, bands like Blind Faith, his stint with the Spencer Davis Group, was familiar with him, but as a young person was more dialed into that more rock and roll driven sound. I think, albums like Arc of a Diver, which we were talking about, it kind of falls into the terrain. We were talking about Don Henley and Building the Perfect Beast recently. It kind of falls into that same terrain in the 1980s, where you have these classic rockers that have decided to venture out on their own, do their own thing. And how do you make music that still coincides with what it truly is that you want to do creatively while also being marketable? There's definitely that essence there. I think that no matter who you are, it's it's important to create music for yourself and to make sure that is the number one priority first and foremost. But any artist wants to sell records. No one wants to go on stage and play to an empty venue. There's always that lingering feeling in the side of any creative person's mind. It's like, will someone enjoy this? Will anyone enjoy this? This is a fascinating record, given that conundrum. Talking about, definitely two massive bands as far as Blind Faith. I know they only put out one record, but phenomenal record, phenomenal lineup of musicians, very controversial cover, as many of you probably know. But working with Traffic is an amazing rock and roll band. I love that outfit. And Spencer Davis Group as well. I think he was like 14 or 15 when he joined the Spencer Davis Group. So, just being at that age and rolling into the 80s, coming off of the mid to late 60s and the 70s, given everything that went on musically in that time frame, let's call it like 15 years or so, like all the different people. Especially being British based, you think about Jimi Hendrix. You think about working with Clapton on one project in Blind Faith. I'm sorry, I was thinking of Ginger Baker there with Cream and Blind Faith, but working with Eric Clapton, just the scene that is around you, the talent, the level of musicianship driving. And I know that Steve Winwood is a guy that, getting into that mid to kind of late 70s time period, Traffic reforms after Blind Faith just decides that this isn't going to work. They do their thing, put out their only record. Traffic gets back together, and then they're done in like 74, 75. And so Steve Winwood's still a busy guy. Working with the likes of George Harrison, Marianne Faithfull, Robert Palmer, amongst many other musicians, in studio sessions, and putting out his self-titled studio debut. But there's a couple of problems that I think really arose with that, and I think that getting into this stage of his life, being so young and working with so many, it's not even just working with so many individuals, it's working with so many talented individuals. And I think that for any creative person, there's this perfect idealized space where, depending on your personality, you're either the creative driver of everything, or you're just surrounded by the most ideal people that you could possibly imagine. And for most people, the reality is, doing it on your own. It's, trying to find that magical lineup of people. That's why it's hard to make it as a rock and roll outfit. It's not just having talent. It's having the creativity. It's having the passion, the drive. It's being able to stomach touring, the process that is touring, being out on the road, being away from home, living in hotels or buses or vans, or, depending on what level you're at. I mean, sometimes it's cars and sometimes it's tents and campsites. Like, you never know. I think that's the beautiful thing about the pursuit of a musical career and the people that I've known in my life. I've met so many special people that have made incredible sacrifices, and hasn't always worked out for them, but there's that admiration of knowing that I mean, it sounds so lame, but knowing when you see a chance to take it. And that's, what I love about this record, the opening track. Not that it's just a massive single, actually. The first of his solo career, and it really led into the 80s with the success of following records. But when you see a chance, it's a song that I think captures the essence of where Steve Winwood was at with his career. He talks about that. He talks about the commercial failure of his solo debut and wondering what the next move is. You gotta pay the bills. It was never a question of whether I would keep pursuing music. That was always going to be a thing. But he talks about, instead of being a recording artist, getting in production, getting into other aspects of the music industry. And for a lot of people over the years, we've seen that. We've seen the stress that can come from being in the spotlight all the time. Especially there's no way to predict these phenomenons. Sometimes you just create something that's the perfect time and place, and all of a sudden there's an explosion around your creativity. And I think most people would argue that have been in that spot that it's one of the most magical, amazing feelings and moments. But then the aftermath, the opprobrium, is everything that goes along with it, as far as the fanatics, the constant interviews and press that you have to do. There's all these obligations depending on the record deal you decide. I mean, there's so much there. And so with this record, I love that Steve Winwood is in a spot where he's kind of got nothing left to lose. And versus his solo debut, he decides to retreat to his home and build a studio. I think one of the funniest things in reading about this record, he's like, dude, I thought this would be cheap, quick, and easy, and it was expensive, hard, and it freaking took forever. And I feel like that's often the case. That's often the scenario in life. I'm feeling that right now. I don't regret my decisions in buying this house around me. I think one day this is going to be a beautiful home when I'm done remodeling it. But life reared its ugly head, and things got stalled as far as progress on construction and everything. And you just never know. You never know what variables life is going to throw at you. And I think that that's another aspect of this record that makes it so compelling, knowing that Steve was in a place where he knew what he needed to do. But with all the hardships that went along with it, he was willing to ride that out. He was willing to take the extra time, to spend the extra money, to take the hard road. I mean, and that's the big thing, especially, and I'll be critical of the time and age that we live in. A lot of people are looking to take the easy route. And so knowing in hindsight the success that this record had, the way it propelled his career through the 80s, this is a prime example of when taking that extra time to take the hard route, to take the path less traveled, and to do things your own way can result in the creation of exceptional art, exceptional work, whatever it is you're doing. It doesn't have to be an album. It doesn't have to be a painting. It can just be your normal everyday process in life, whether you're a plumber and you're trying to build your own business, like whatever it might be. It's about the ability to do things on your own terms and the freedom that goes along with that. And I feel a lot of us are stuck in that rut of of working 9 to 5s or just, the kind of everyday mundane jobs that pay the bills and they get us to where they need to be, but they don't necessarily satiate that feeling of desire that we have to do what we want, to ultimately be in a spot where we're getting up every day and putting our efforts and our heart and soul into something that we are passionate about and that we know will have an impact. I think a big part of that process too is the wariness that some individuals have with with not knowing. It's always a risk. Like, you never know if something's going to hit with people, if it's going to resonate. And again, that's where I always argue that you should make art for yourself. It shouldn't be about doing something for other people, because at that point, commercially, if it flops, it's like, fuck it, who cares? You still did something that made you happy, that was constructive. It satisfied your creative urges. There's 1,000 different things that go along with that process that that you could still find happiness in and find something to be proud in. But when you're a musician and you're trying to pay the bills, that's an entirely different matter. So I love that this record is a sort of revival, especially in the time and place, 1980. We're talking about, like, for real, I think the Clash put out London Calling just maybe a couple of months before this record was put out. You have this fascination with rawness, edge, punk. It's the new thing. And even post-punk a little bit, starting to get into the 80s with new wave. There's this whole shift and redirection as far as people's taste in music, what is popular, what people are craving. And the smooth adult contemporary sounds that Steve Winwood was putting together on his first record and is ultimately putting together on this second record, it wasn't really what you would call like TRL marketable back in those days. And that's even aging myself in a little bit, taking that back to like the mid to late 90s and what was popular and what people were into. But it's fascinating that this record, given that his career was kind of falling off a little bit and that he found himself in a tough spot with the challenge of trying to come back, trying to make an impact, trying to make music that has an impression on people in a time and place where this style wasn't really what people were wanting. And there's a lot of it that feels like the soft rock influence coming off of yacht rock in the 70s, especially. Think of bands like Steely Dan; they're the first that come to mind. I love that scene. To each their own. I didn't have a chance to check it out, but Rick Beato talking about how yacht rock sucks, and I just saw the title. I didn't have a chance to listen to the whole video, but I disagree with him. I think that there's a place for it. I think that there are bands that dabbled in that or that were driven by it that produced incredible music, some really good stuff, and it's all about mood. It's and that's music in general. I'm not waking up every morning like looking to put on the smooth sounds of mid-70s rock and roll, but from time to time, and depending on the event or the mood or whatever it might be, that music rocks. I think it's phenomenal, and I think that for guys like Steve Winwood, for guys like Don Henley, it was a big part of the foundation that drove their sounds into the 80s with success. Big part of that is the new technology that was around them too. Don Henley especially, like I loved digging into Building the Perfect Beast and just reading about all the different synthesizers and everything that he was using. It was just, everything at that point, so state of the art, and trying to move with the future, going back to that old Jim Morrison interview where I think most of us have seen that. He talks about the future of music and how it is based in electronica. These synthesized, computer-generated sounds. And so knowing that music was there and then watching what these guys did, it's basically like new wave soft rock is kind of the sound that they developed. But it's tough to put a finger on it too, because this record, Arc of the Diver is like, it's so funky. And knowing that Steve Winwood played all the bass riffs on this, all the instrumentation done by him completely, I'm absolutely in love with that. Teaming up with Will Jennings, as far as songwriting, he contributed 4 of the songs with him. Vivian Stanshell, contributed to the writing. Arc of the Diver, and then Secondhand Woman and Dust were co-written by George Fleming as well. But it's a like Arc of a Diver is, it's a record that, given its time and place, maybe shouldn't have blown up the way that it did. But I think that When You See a Chance, or While You See a Chance, I'm going back and forth between things. While You See a Chance is, it's a song that, leading off on this record and knowing what it's about, those opportunities where, life can be tough, life can bog you down, it can present its challenges, but oftentimes, even in the midst of overcoming them, there are other opportunities where sometimes you just have to say, to hell with it, I'm going to go with this. And, and talking about the difficulty in building a studio, the expenses that were involved with that, it's really cool to see Steve Winwood, come out on the other side with this record. Keep laughing because Robert Christgau, I don't even know how you say his last name. I don't really care because he's so negative. He doesn't like anything. The dude is a bummer. He might be the biggest bummer in the history of music conversation, like, ever. Just absolutely brutal. I do love listening to, or I should say, reading the opinions of Robert Palmer, one of my favorite music critics, and way more of a musician than Robert ever is. He's still around now, but Robert Palmer, talking about the way that this transformed Steve Winwood into like a traditional, a rock traditionalist, so to speak, and I love that statement, talking about the idea of getting back to the foundations of where rock and roll came from, talking about the blues bass, and talking about even jazz influences. Let's call it what it is. It's the African American influence, and talking about one of the labels that Steve Winwood gets is Blue Eyed Soul, and that's where it comes from. It's like the Righteous Brothers. These two dudes showing up to the radio station, and DJs are like, "Oh man, you guys are white, no way." And not that it matters, but I mean, it's a big thing, and I don't think it gets discussed enough, talking about the influence of Motown and the Standing in the Shadows of Motown. If you guys have never seen that documentary, check it out. I would just make that statement right there. I think that movie in and of itself brilliantly captures how so many African American musicians have been overlooked in light of these successful white musicians that have moved into their place. Elvis is probably the easiest one to point out, but also not to say that he wasn't incredibly talented. I think that most music purists, you talk to people, at the end of the day, like, that shit just doesn't matter. It's not what it was about. But people like to coin terms and ascribe labels to things, and it is what it is. But this record, getting into the track list, opening up with that signature track, While You See a Chance. You get the synths that build in quick, big atmospheric open. There's this organ element that feels a little gospel driven in the opening of that track, but then it gets immediately to business, taking on this totally contemporary feel, driven by synths, driven by this light, airy instrumentation. There are definitely elements of yacht rock working into that breezy, softer side of what is essentially adult contemporary. I think that this album, this sound, these artists that I've mentioned in this time period, it's the beginnings of that genre, so to speak. And I feel like it's a label that just gets, the older I've gotten, obviously the more open I am to it. But I remember being younger and thinking about it and seeing that label and just being like, ugh, like, what? No, not into that at all. But our tastes change as we age, and you come to these realizations that labels are often they're often given unfairly, and even then they don't necessarily do justice to what is actually going on creatively with those sounds. So While You See a Chance, an amazing song, it just blew his solo career open, and I love that. And I love that with his second solo record, breaking out and becoming a big household name on his own. Not that he wasn't before, but I think what you have here is he's kind of like Snoop Dogg at this point. If I can just throw that analogy out there. And what I mean by that is that for those of us that are old enough, we remember Snoop. But now there's this new generation of people that see Snoop Dogg and they see him on all these television ads. I mean, just blowing everything up. And I don't think they really necessarily see him as the rapper. It's more like Snoop the personality. And so while we're talking about Steve Winwood, the rock and roller, the group artist versus the solo artist, and that's kind of different, there's still that idea of, in 1980, you have this, ever-changing world of music and all these different sounds driven by the development of technology. And you have an artist that, starting with the likes of the Spencer Davis Group and Traffic and what he was doing with those outfits. And then within the span of a decade and a half, now all of a sudden he sounds like this. It's like, it's a trip. It is pretty wild to hear that. But I mean, I think it's really cool that you have older fans that experience that same growth as far as their taste, what they're into. Maybe it went along with the ebb and flow of what is popular in contemporary culture. And then you have this new younger generation that, they hear this music and they're like, oh man, that guy's groovy. He sounds great. And then they go back and they're just like, whoa, wait, like he was in Blind Faith? Like he fronted Traffic? Like what? Like there's no way. There's absolutely no way. And I remember feeling that way too when I first discovered that, getting into his 80s stuff, listening to that for the first time. And I was like, Steve Winwood, the solo artist, is way different than Steve Winwood, the blues-driven musician, the guy that we saw in the late 60s and the early 70s. I saw him open for Tom Petty. I'm just going to throw a little side note in there because personal stories are fun, and that show was amazing. Saw them back in 2008, and just the very thought of Steve Winwood opening for anybody, to me, is crazy, especially in that point in time, being as established as he is. But I'm sure that chatting with Tom Petty, working out the details of that whole tour and just going into it, there was certainly this essence, oh, Hufflepuff just pulled up right behind me. He's feeling very snuggy right now. It's a little chilly in the house. That show, watching him open, that's a tough act to follow. I almost envied or almost didn't envy, Tom Petty for having to go up there and do his thing afterward, because Steve Winwood put on such a phenomenal show to open up that concert. But Tom Petty, incredible. The man, if any of you had a chance to see him while he was alive, oh my goodness. Love Mike Campbell. He was playing this big old Florida Gators guitar. Like, I love that he's all about that homage there. But we need to get back to the track list here. While You See a Chance, your album opener. Arc of a Diver is your second track. The title track, since sort of like splash in to build this track up. There's a little bit of guitar that works in there as well. It finds its feet in this light, funky groove. The synths drop in. The verse gives the track a 70s soul feel. I really love the way that the synths are removed from the verses, and they have more of that soulful, like early 70s kind of like funky R&B drive. But the synths, they continue to like work playfully in and out. And there's definitely this moment in the coda where you get this drone style synth that really just takes hold and really has a large impact on the composition. And I dig the way that this song slowly builds with that element and finishes on that. Secondhand Woman is your third song. Funky bass moves with drums behind these crystal-like synths. Really dig the synth element on this track. The verse features driving percussion with bass that it pops around the synths. I really just like the pop and the drive and the bass, and knowing that Steve is playing that instrument on this record just makes me love it even more. They take on this swirling effect at times. They soar at others. The dynamic there is really fun and playful, and really another highlight. Working with all the synth elements on this record the way that he did, it seems so out of character given where he comes from, right? But in the time and place, this had to have just been mind-blowing. This all sounds so just run-of-the-mill these days, knowing where technology is at almost 45 years later. But knowing how new all this stuff was, how fresh it sounded, people's ears were not attuned to this. And so, this is another one of those songs that I really feel is fun for that reason, and very, in 1980, surprising. Slow Down, Sundown is your fourth track. Bright vocal driven by this folkish arpeggiated guitar. I really love that element. Bits of piano and mandolin that they give the song kind of a Baroque feel at moments as well. It captures R&B with rhythm and soul on the organ. I really love the kind of like gospel element that is there as well with that instrumentation. Big solo that sounds like it's synth driven. It could be guitar, it could be Steve messing around with pedals. I'm not exactly sure what the instrumentation is on that particular track that's driving the solo, but I know it's just downright nasty and definitely a highlight of the track. And I like the way that song sort of drifts into this kind of like gospel funk element to close out the A side of the record. Spanish Dancer is going to open up side 2. Get these pulsating psychedelic synths. They build over another light percussion that carries in the backdrop. I really dig the way that the percussion is. It's so complimentary. It's so well done from a production angle. It's definitely a highlight for me on that track. Bass hits with an agenda on this thing. When it comes in, Steve starts singing. Oh, it's so nasty. It's definitely just a moment that pops in the song. There's this feeling of Gary Wright, My Love Is Alive. That's the influence that I'm feeling in that song. It kind of reminds me of that track a little bit. Night Train is your second track. Big old track, almost 8 minutes long. Retro funk and soul meets this 80s new wave and pop feel. There's lots of sparse instrumentation that kind of it all moves around itself. And the way that these components work around one another and then come together is really exceptional. It's probably the best part of this track, and that's saying a lot because it is a really fun song, being the penultimate song on this record. The funky drive, the big opening guitar solo that I mean, this thing opens up with a guitar solo it's got to be close to 2 minutes long. Chorus finds this track moving into slightly darker mood. I really like the way that the texture and the intensities build behind the chorus element in the song. And then it's going to lead into your final track, Dust, which takes on a very synth-driven jazz feel. And this is one of those tracks talking about people's minds being blown in the span of a couple of decades. Think about a generation of people that, maybe were getting into adult contemporary as the 80s were coming around, but feeling the influence of jazz, knowing that you have this very dominant sound. And, even at the time, jazz has always been jazz. Jazz has always done its thing. I feel like for the most part, it sits in the backdrop of popular music, and that's unfortunate. But it's always there, and it's always relevant, and it's always driving creativity of those pop sounds. It's so important. And so this is a song that, I think the first time people heard the combination of these two elements, this, 1980s mellow mid-tempo pop and soul meets jazz feel, they were just probably like, what is this? Like, what is going on? What is Steve doing? And it's impressive. Like the way that it moves between subtlety and moments that pop. The piano and synths really have an amazing effect. Love the piano. The piano acting the way the drums did in Night Train. Just driving and being the foundation of the song, but not really being there at the forefront. Just quietly like being there in the back to support. And I dig that. And then the coda of the song, I really love the way that the piano and the synths really go to work. It's a hell of a way to close out. What is an impressive record? This is a record that it had been a minute since I'd listened to it, and I totally spaced it. It had been released on December 31st. So I've had a lot of fun putting together this episode, revisiting this record, and it's one that, given his solo catalog and his career, While You See a Chance is going to be the commercial highlight, obviously, but there are 6 other songs that have so much substance. Lyrically, they're amazing. Musically, they are complex. There's so much fun instrumentation that is constantly keeping you on your toes. It's it makes for you a unique listening experience every single time that you approach it. And I'm pumped about this record, happy to be able to talk about it, and I hope you guys enjoyed this record tonight. At some point while you're getting ready to oh my goodness, I sound like Elmer Fudd, getting ready to ring in the new year. With that being said, I'm going to sign off, enjoy the rest of my night, get into a book, and I will see you guys in 2025. Have a good night. Happy New Year. Be safe. We'll see you next time.